listener production.
Hi, Simon Beaton with you for this episode of The Briefing. We've long heard about the dangers of fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that's 50 times stronger than heroin. But now there's another incredibly dangerous synthetic opioid that's starting to be detected more and more frequently in Australia: Nitazene. While fentanyl is 50 times more potent than heroin, Nitazene can be 25 times stronger than fentanyl. In April, Nitazene was linked to a cluster of 20 overdoses in Western Sydney, and over the weekend, Canberra's pill testing service detected Nitazene in a drug sample for the first time. So what is this drug, and how worried should we be? Professor Suzanne Nielsen is the Deputy Director of the Monash Addiction Research Centre in Melbourne, and she joins us now. Professor, why is Nitazene so dangerous?
So one of the concerns with Nitazenes is that we actually don't know that much about them. So what we do know is that they are very potent. They've been often compared to fentanyl, but in fact, some of them are many times more potent than fentanyl. But we actually know a lot less about them than fentanyl. Fentanyl was developed for medical use, and so there have been lots of studies on it. With the Nitazenes, they actually didn't progress to medical use. The early studies in the 1950s suggested that their safety profile wasn't really ideal for using for pain relief. There were severe side effects, including respiratory depression, so they didn't progress to medical use. And so it is that high potency that's very concerning.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly scary. With the what was detected in Canberra over the weekend, was that pure Nitazene that they found?
So the Nitazenes are a family of compounds. So they're all related with a similar chemical structure. They're all opioids. So they all have a similar effect to drugs that you probably have heard of, like morphine or heroin. But there are lots of different chemical structures with slightly different actions. And so the one that was detected on the weekend was N-pyrrolidinoprotonitazene. It's quite a potent nitazene.
Yeah, well, I saw some pictures of it as well. And the drug sample, it's brown and crumbly. It actually kind of looks almost like instant coffee. Is that kind of normal? Is that what this drug looks like?
So the thing about nitazenes is they've been detected in all kinds of different formats. So we have seen sometimes they're detected in powdered form, where they can be from sort of off-white to brown, but they're also often found in drugs that are packaged as other drugs. So, for example, we've seen in other countries these drugs have been sold as oxycodone, packaged up as falsified pharmaceuticals. And so some of the situations that we see is people are attempting to buy pharmaceutical drugs online. They purchase these drugs that are packaged up to look like pharmaceuticals, like oxycodone, a pain medication, but when they're tested, they actually contain a potent opioid like nitazene or a fentanyl or something that's different to what the person thought that they were purchasing. We've seen nitazenes in Australia detected in drugs sold as ketamine and also MDMA, for example. So popping up in all kinds of places and not a consistent appearance depending on what they're being purchased as often.
A bit of speculation, but do you think that the person who gave this sample to CanTest, do you think that they thought that they had nitazene?
We have seen that there are a small number of people who are intentionally purchasing nitazenes, people who are seeking a sort of a strong opioid, but most commonly and in most of the cases where there's been harm, people didn't realise that they were purchasing and consuming these highly potent opioids.
Yeah, okay. So on that, can you tell me about some other situations where nitazene has been found in Australia? Is it common?
Look, it's not common. We've had a small number of detections. I've seen it reported that there have been sort of 16 deaths in Victoria. Not all of those are publicly accessible on the information systems that researchers can access yet. So there's really only been a handful that we've been able to get detailed information about. I guess the concern is what might happen. So we have seen the number of nitazene detections and deaths increase pretty rapidly overseas. We've seen, large clusters in the UK, for example. And we had had a couple of clusters in New South Wales where there were, perhaps 20 overdoses in a short space of time in a confined geographic location where it seems like those nitazenes have been detected in different drugs. So we are starting to see these alerts with increasing frequency in the recent months.
How about in the US? This is very widespread over there now?
So the US has a really significant synthetic opioid problem, but the majority of synthetic opioid deaths still in the US is from illicitly manufactured fentanyl. So people are probably familiar with fentanyl. It's a strong opioid. It's available in Australia and in fact, most in Australia from fentanyl that's supplied as a pharmaceutical. But what's happened in the US is there's been a lot of fentanyl deaths with illicitly manufactured fentanyl, made not in pharmaceutical companies, but in illegal laboratories and then shipped overseas. There are nitazenes that have been detected, and they are more commonly detected in the US just in terms of the sheer number. But still, it's fentanyl that's dominating the deaths and the statistics over there. But as we've seen greater restrictions on fentanyl and greater, international controls around fentanyl and fentanyl substances, and in the US as well around their laws, we would expect to see more nitazenes as people try and circumvent those international laws.
So what happens when someone has an overdose on fentanyl? Can they be saved?
They can be saved, and we do have a medication available in Australia, in particular, naloxone.
Yep.
It's available. You can get it for free in most pharmacies. It's funded by the Commonwealth Government, so you can go in there. It doesn't cost you anything, and the pharmacist is able to provide it. We know that works against fentanyl, but what we know compared to, say, a heroin overdose is that the window of time that you've got to respond is much shorter. So often we're looking at just a couple of minutes. With a heroin overdose, we often have, maybe up to 25 minutes to respond. So it has become much more important now, we're saying, to see things like the nitazenes and, potentially fentanyl emerge in drugs, particularly where they're not expected, that we have people in the community know that naloxone is available and have it on them. You might not have that time to wait to respond that we've typically had with heroin. I guess the other thing is to be aware of is that when we see these drugs like nitazenes appear in maybe something that's been purchased as ketamine or MDMA, these are often populations who might not be that familiar with what an opioid overdose looks like.
Yes.
So knowing the signs and symptoms, particularly maybe in different scenes, so in music festival scenes where typically people aren't using opioids, we do really need to increase our harm reduction response and knowledge in those populations and make sure naloxone is something people are familiar with and is available. It's actually quite straightforward to use. So we do have something that we can roll out in response.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about that. If somebody is going to take illegal drugs and they're concerned about the purity or whether it could be laced with nitazene or fentanyl or heroin or whatever, how can they maximise their chances of staying alive and staying safe?
So the best case outcome is that people aren't using substances where they don't know what's contained, because obviously that increases the risk. We do have in a number of places now in Australia, we have in Brisbane and Canberra, for example, drug checking. And so if people are able to access those services, that would be a great thing to be able to get a sense of whether or not the drug that people are using is likely to contain one of these very potent substances. If that isn't possible, having naloxone on hand is really important. That allows people to respond really quickly. We have these nasal formulations where it's literally just one spray in one nostril. It works after a couple of minutes. It's very simple to explain to people how to use. So being able to go and either talk to a harm reduction service or a pharmacy and request naloxone if you might be in an area where people are going to be using drugs, particularly if medical help's not very close by. That would be a really good thing to do.
And anybody can do that?
Anybody can do that. Any member of the public could go to a community pharmacy. Not all pharmacies are participating in the program at this point, but all pharmacies are eligible to sign up. So you ask a pharmacy if they're providing free naloxone, and hopefully they are. We know the majority are, in fact. More than 60% of pharmacies are already doing this. The other thing to be aware of is not to use drugs on your own. So naloxone requires that there is somebody else present that knows what symptoms they're looking for and how to use naloxone. If you're on your own, even if you've got naloxone there, you're not going to be able to administer it to yourself. There's very little that you can do. So one of the harm reduction messages is to really make sure, if you are using drugs, that someone else knows what you're using and that there is naloxone around.
Do we have any statistics at all that show how frequently drugs are laced? So say MDMA or ketamine are laced with opioids?
So one of the big questions we have at the moment is why? Why are we finding these novel, potent opioids turning up in drugs like MDMA? It's not a very good business model if you are selling drugs to be giving highly potent opioids to people who aren't expecting them. And I don't know that we've got the evidence to show that this is something that's happening intentionally. I think it's more likely that this is contamination. So there may be multiple drugs being produced in the same setting. These are very potent drugs. It doesn't take very much to do harm. And these aren't being produced in pharmaceutical conditions with great quality controls. That's one of the prevailing theories, is that these are accidents that are happening with contamination as opposed to intentionally lacing those drugs. Nevertheless, whatever the reason that's causing these drugs to be there, the outcome is the same. That creates really considerable risks to consumers. And because these substances are just so potent, a very small amount is still enough to be fatal for somebody who isn't used to taking them.
And one last question for you. Do you think that the nitazene that was detected in Canberra, is this an outlier, or do you think that it is a sign that nitazene is becoming more frequent in Australia and that we should be expecting to hear more about these cases in the immediate future?
Look, what we've seen so far is certainly a pattern of increasing detections, but a small number of detections. We have seen a number of deaths and non-fatal overdoses, but they are still quite small in number. So we don't have a really good sense at the moment about how common nitazenes are out there being used, because a lot of drugs, people don't know what they're using. A lot of drugs aren't being tested, and a lot of the testing facilities that we have aren't necessarily testing for nitazenes either. So we do have quite good data, for example, for cases that might present to emergency departments in Australia or for coroner's reports. But in terms of what's being out there, a lot of drugs that are used, nobody knows exactly what they're using. I don't think there's a large amount of nitazenes out there because we would be seeing a corresponding large amount of overdoses. So I have some confidence that it's still fairly early days, but in terms of the extent, we just don't have good information because most people don't know what's in the drugs that they're taking.
Professor Susie Nielsen, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
No problems. It's a pleasure.
Professor Suzanne Nielsen there. And that is it for this episode. Thanks for joining me. We'll be back again tomorrow morning from 6 a.m. And if you found this episode interesting, forward it on to a friend right now and make sure that you've clicked the subscribe or follow button. We really do appreciate it. I'm Simon Beaton. See you soon.